In the years before the Naboo crisis, the High Council offered Qui-Gon Jinn a permanent chair. Accepting would have moved him from fieldwork to policy and adjudication, and it would have separated him from his Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, because council members were expected to reduce long-term frontline assignments and take on collective duties in the temple. Qui-Gon evaluated the offer against two commitments. First, his training bond with Obi-Wan was still stabilizing. Their styles had only recently aligned after a period of friction, and a force transfer would interrupt a master-apprentice pairing that had finally begun producing consistent results. Second, his living force practice, prioritizing what the force revealed in the present moment over institutional precedent, required him to remain among civilians, diplomats, and outsystem disputes where direct observation could guide his decisions without mediation. He tested the practical impact before deciding. He attended council deliberations as an invited voice, weighed how often consensus favored caution over intervention, and measured what that would mean in crises where a delayed response cost lives. He compared that to field outcomes from his recent missions, cases resolved by acting on immediate insight rather than waiting for authorization, and concluded that the seat would exchange effectiveness for influence he did not intend to use. He informed the council that he would not take the chair and kept Obi-Wan as his Padawan. The result fixed two trajectories. Qui-Gon stayed a roving problem solver whose independence the council tolerated rather than directed, and Obi-Wan received uninterrupted mentorship that matured him for his trials on schedule. When Naboo erupted, the same independence that had kept Qui-Gon out of the council chamber put him in the desert on Tatooine, where he identified Anakin Skywalker, an outcome that would not have occurred if he had moved into temple governance. After the temple hangar bombing, Ahsoka was framed by Barriss Offee, stripped of her status, and expelled to stand trial in a Republic military court. While Anakin traced the actual culprit, Ahsoka was held without order protection and presented to the public as a traitor, severing her access to temple council, records, and support. When Offee confessed, the council reversed course. They offered full reinstatement, described the ordeal as Ahsoka's great trial, and attempted to fold her back into service with formal apologies. The reinstatement would have restored her rank, privileges, and residence, returning her to frontline duty under Jedi command. Ahsoka declined. She returned her Padawan beads to Anakin and stated that the Order's willingness to expel her on suspicion showed a break in trust that ceremony could not repair. She cited the Council's political dependence on the Senate and the military court as evidence that the Order had shifted away from its own investigatory standards and presumption of a Jedi's integrity under crisis. Her refusal removed a battle-tested commander from the Republic Order of Battle on the eve of rising separatist pressure and left Anakin without his most stabilizing partner, accelerating his isolation. It also established the first visible public case of a prominent Jedi turning down the Council's authority rather than accepting an apology bound to the same system that had failed her. Near the end of the Republic, Master Yaddle chose to step down from the High Council rather than continue shaping policy from the chamber. She had served as a stabilizing voice since the Naboo era, but growing alignment between council procedure and Senate politics convinced her that decisions were being paced by optics and jurisdiction instead of immediate needs on the ground. Resignation for a seated master meant surrendering voting rights, daily briefings, and authority over mission assignments. Yaddle evaluated the cost against her purpose, freeing herself to investigate disturbances personally without waiting for consensus or being bound by appearance calendars. She filed her intent to resign and began quietly closing council obligations while keeping access to temple systems necessary for fieldwork. The same independence put her in position to detect Count Dooku's divergence. Tracking irregularities around a compromised mission archive and an erased flight path, she tailed Dooku to a covert meeting and confronted him in a hangar. By stepping off the council, she no longer spoke as the Order's policy arm. She spoke as a master invoking the Code's plain requirements to identify the threat, demand surrender, and act to protect the Republic if refused. Her choice illustrates a specific kind of refusal, not declining an initial invitation to serve, but rejecting continued participation when the Council's institutional momentum no longer aligned with her reading of the Force. In practical terms, it shows a senior Jedi placing field action and personal accountability over committee authority, even at the cost of stepping away from the Order's highest seat of influence. Dooku's break began with a pattern he observed on missions. Jedi were sent to stabilize worlds where Senate interests, not local justice, set the rules of engagement. In Raxus and similar disputes, he watched corrupt officials use the Order's neutrality to freeze action until damage was irreversible. He returned to Coruscant arguing that the Order's deference to the Senate was eroding its purpose. Inside the temple, he pressed the Council to confront political capture directly, naming senators, calling for public exposure, and demanding that missions prioritize facts on the ground over committee optics. The Council answered with caution and process, authorizing investigations that moved slower than the crises themselves. Dooku read this as institutional drift the chamber would not correct. He tendered his resignation rather than serve a policy he judged compromised. Resignation ended his vote, briefings, and authority to set missions. It freed him to pursue reform without council constraints. When Qui-Gon's report about a Sith on Tatooine reached Coruscant and the council hesitated to act beyond limited measures, Dooku treated that hesitation as final proof that remaining would not change outcomes. After Qui-Gon's death, appeals were made to keep Dooku in the Order's structure. He refused, making clear that he would not return under the same governance. The act functioned as a public turning down of the council's authority. A senior master chose departure over continued complicity with a system he judged unfit to meet the moment. At the start of the Clone War, Ram Koda refused to command a Grand Army formation built on Kaminoan clones. He argued that soldiers grown to obey removed the judgment a Jedi general needed at the front, and that the Council's acceptance of a manufactured army tied the Order to the Senate's timeline and budgets instead of the Force's needs. Rather than take a standard corps, he raised a militia from planetary volunteers he had vetted in peacetime, structuring it around small units with local guides and officers who could question orders without fear of conditioning. His refusal had two operational effects. First, he ran independent campaigns, strikes on droid foundries and shipyards chosen for strategic yield rather than headline value, often launched without waiting for temple authorization windows. Second, he built an internal check against mission drift by keeping his command staff outside temple rotation. Veterans in his circle could challenge him directly when targets slid from military necessity into political messaging. When Order 66 was triggered across the holonet, Koda's non-clone troops did not receive the kill directive. The militia pulled him off the line and exfiltrated through pre-planned safe routes he had established for civilians earlier in the war. The Council's doctrine stated that centralized orders executed by conditioned troops which failed in a single minute. Koda's refusal to adopt that doctrine preserved a Jedi commander who could continue fighting the Empire and training successors precisely because he had turned down the Council's chosen way of war. The Council authorized Voss to infiltrate Dooku's circle with Asajj Ventress as his handler and partner with two fixed limits: maintain cover and break contact if compromise risked turning him. After capture and interrogation by Dooku, Voss returned altered, volatile in effect and evasive in debrief. The Council ordered the operation terminated and directed him to sever ties with Ventress pending evaluation. Voss declined to stand down. He argued that the mission's original goal, removing Dooku to end the war, remained valid and that proximity to Ventress was the only viable access. He reactivated the plan without sanction, shifting from intelligence gathering to a direct assassination attempt and concealing his state of mind from masters assigned to monitor him. The unsanctioned strike failed and accelerated his slide toward Dooku's methods before Ventress pulled him back. When he finally reappeared before the Council, the file showed a Jedi who had rejected recall, concealed risk, and continued a covert war on his own authority. A deliberate turning down of the Council's control in favor of unilateral action. Jolee self-exiled from the Order after the Exar Kun era, rejecting a council he viewed as rigid in judgment and slow to act. On Kashyyyk, he continued to arbitrate disputes and intervene in crises without invoking temple authority, defining his role by obligation rather than rank. When events on Dantooine and the Starforge War drew him back into galactic stakes, the door to formal return was open. He could have re-entered the Order with full status under the Council's supervision. He refused. He joined the campaign as an independent ally instead, insisting on choosing when and how to act without committee deadlines or doctrinal constraints. Each time counsel or command was offered as a pathway back into the hierarchy, Jolee answered with practical help and kept his distance. The refusal preserved his freedom to speak candidly, to cut through stalemates, and to walk away when the Council's caution diverged from conditions on the ground. As a Padawan in the late Republic, Ferrus Olin requested release from the Jedi Order after a mission ended with a fellow Padawan's death and exposed corrosive rivalry inside his cohort. The Council was prepared to continue his training with supervision and corrective mentorship. He declined, turned in his braid, and left Temple service. Resignation ended his access to assignments, archives, and protections, but it also freed him from a chain of command he no longer trusted to shape sound judgment under pressure. He redirected his skills to civilian covers, then to anti-imperial work after the Purge, operating in cells that did not answer to a council at all. By refusing to remain under council oversight when he judged himself and the institution unfit to proceed together, Ferrus converted a fractured apprenticeship into a deliberate, independent course of action that he could own end to end. Across these cases, turning down the council wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but it was a tactical choice about where a Jedi could do the most good. Sometimes it preserved a partnership, sometimes a principle, sometimes a life that would have been lost to policy. If this helped you read these moments with clearer eyes, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. In the comments, tell me which refusal changed the galaxy the most and why. As always, thanks for watching.